Great. Let's go ahead and get started. We want to once again thank everyone for joining our peer support call today. We're going to be doing a deep dive on eviction moratoriums. My name is Karen Romero. I am the Training Institute Director for Freedom Network USA. And we're really excited about today's call to really get an understanding of where eviction moratoriums currently stand, what's the status of it, how they may impact survivors or programs that you're working with. And also have a conversation with Renee and Noel from the National Housing Law Project, who will be leading the discussion today. And as I mentioned, we want to hear your questions because likely other participants have similar questions, so definitely feel free to include those in the chat box. And if you feel comfortable, make that available to both presenters and attendees. Let's go to the next slide. Great. For today, we are going to be recording the peer support call so that we were able to share it with you all in a couple of weeks through a follow-up email, and any sort of resources that we mentioned today or that are covered, we'll make sure that we attach either the documents or the links to those. So just know that we will be sending those out in the next couple of weeks. Like we mentioned, we do encourage you to engage with speakers and also with other attendees. So feel free to ask questions or share, your experience or comments in the chat box. And like for the people that joined us a little bit earlier, we were asking people to share what city and state they were joining from. So if you haven't already, if you will chat us and let us know, that would be great. And finally, we do have closed captioning. And so if you see at the bottom of your screen, there's going to be a button that says CC. If you hit that, then you'll see the captioning come up. Next slide. Perfect. And we see that there are a number of people chatting on where they're coming in. So that's really great to hear. Thank you. Today's webinar is being brought to you by the Housing Training and Technical Assistance Project under the Office for Victims of Crime. So through Freedom Network, we provide a number of resources, materials, training, and support to service providers in learning and understanding best practices and housing models to serve survivors of human trafficking. And so this is one of the areas that we have gotten a lot of questions about. We've heard from the field is needed as far as where survivors may be evicted, how the eviction moratoriums may cover them or protect them. And so we want to make sure that we're bringing the experts that can answer those questions and help us think through some solutions and at least have a sense of where the current status is. The next webinar will be in November, and so there will be an email coming out shortly, and that's going to be on utilizing VOCA funds in order to house survivors of trafficking. So we just wanted to put that on your radar. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. Perfect. So today we have the pleasure of having the National Housing Law Project with us. So I just want to do a brief introduction and then I'll turn it over to them. Noelle Porter is the Director of Government Affairs at the National Housing Law Project. She is responsible for managing the relationships with Congress and the administration, organizational policy priority development, and strategic advocacy, planning, and execution. Prior to joining NHLP, she managed congressional relations for the National Alliance to End Homelessness, and after beginning her career in health policy. And she also worked as a case manager for homeless services, a service provider for homeless services in Tampa. We also have Renee Williams, who's a senior staff attorney with the National Housing Law Project. She focuses on fair housing and equal access issues, as well as including national origin discrimination, housing access for persons with limited English proficiency, housing rights for domestic violence survivors, including Violence Against Women Act or VAWA, and the obligation of affirmatively further fair housing. So as you can tell, we have two people that have a lot of experience, and also these are the people that we look to as far as getting guidance on eviction moratoriums. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Noelle and Renee. Like I mentioned, please put your questions in the chat box. We will have a Q&A section at the end, and also anything that's not answered or that you're curious about, throughout their remarks, feel free to put it in there, and we'll make sure that we address it towards the end. Thanks.
Thanks so much, y'all. I'm just going to get us started. I think, there's a lot of news about the eviction moratoriums, as well as conversation about whether or not we should expect relief from Congress in the form of rental assistance, et cetera. And I wanted to just contextualize all of this at the federal policy level. And then Renee's going to be able to really walk you through the ways that you can advocate and use these policies on the ground to help navigate this really complicated time, and especially for your clients with very complex needs. So I wanted to begin by just saying that I'm sure if any of you are kind of light news readers, medium news readers, you have heard that there's obviously a back and forth between the House and the White House and then the Senate on any sort of COVID relief package. In our previous webinar, I think we discussed that in May, the House passed a very comprehensive relief package called the HEROES Act, that contained, billions for states and localities. It was addressing issues regarding small payment loans or small business loans, individual payments, healthcare, and it also contained $100 billion in rental assistance for through the ESG program that could be used to folks facing eviction, as well as a comprehensive moratorium issue that would be issued for a year. It would have been in May, and really kind of codified or put into statute the protections that we're asking for in considering the CDC, et cetera. And so obviously, we don't have that package. There have been sort of a few different renewed efforts in the last, I'd say, month, realistically. You may have seen some reporting that indicated that the White House, including Secretary Mnuchin from the Treasury, as well as the Chief of Staff to the President, Mark Meadows, were negotiating with Nancy Pelosi to try to kind of fill the gap. The original Democratic proposal was $3 trillion, more than $3 trillion in relief. The White House came back with one. Everyone sort of started talking in the middle. And then the Senate has largely been uninvolved in the talks. And so then probably you saw a report that said that the president had shut down the talks and that there would be no more relief negotiations. Shortly thereafter, he said, we're going to talk and we're going to get even more than the Democrats want. But what's really happening is that there is no real space. There's no kind of overlap in the Venn diagrams for agreement right now. And so we've all but been guaranteed that there will not be a relief package before the election. And then it will be highly questionable whether or not Republicans are really willing to show up and have those negotiations in the lame duck session if they've lost ground in the Senate and if they've lost the presidency. And so we really have to be operating in a framework here where we can't count on federal rental assistance at this time. And so we're going to talk to you about a number of different things, and we can even talk about some of the forthcoming resources from the NHLP in ways to sort of advocate for your clients on the ground without being able to use that federal assistance that all of us have been hoping and negotiating and advocating for. And so I want to provide that context. I can answer questions about it. I know it's a little bit weedsy and far above the kind of real work that you guys do on the ground. But it does feed into the fact that, in September, the CDC issued a really blanket moratorium on evictions across the country, sort of remarkably covered people in private housing, even without federal assistance. It had some gaps, and there was a lot of confusion and chaos in the way that it was implemented. And we had really been on a path to try to close those gaps and really say, like, this is tenant focused. This is to stop the spread of the pandemic. And what we want to do is keep tenants in their homes, when they are moving from couch to couch or home to home or from shelter to shelter, we really see an increased spread. And unfortunately, at the end of last week, and I mean, the real weekend, the CDC issued guidance or FAQs that sort of undermined the efforts that we were making and even undermined the order itself. And Renee is really going to walk through the specifics on this. But I think it's important to understand that there are two broad arguments that are happening. One is that tenants tenants are submitting these declaration forms, and again, I keep saying, but Renee will get into the weeds on this. They're submitting these declaration forms to certify that they are covered by the protection. The CDC amended their guidance to give landlords the right to kind of question or to challenge those certifications. And that's problematic, and I think you probably know why, but Renee will discuss it. And then also, they argued that eviction doesn't, in the definition in the order, doesn't cover filings. And so they've sort of granted permission to landlords to begin filing evictions now, and simply said that it cannot result in the tenant being exited the premises before December 31. And so we'll talk today about, just how vulnerable that makes folks, the process of intimidation, illegal eviction, et cetera, and the ways to really kind of work around that. And so we are, currently sort of fully analyzing that CDC guidance and the problems that it may cause, and working to really put out detailed information for advocates across the country on how to still use the CDC order as it stands, to the best of your abilities and to the most defense of your tenants. And so Renee's going to kind of walk through some of that stuff now. I don't know if we want to pause for a second and see if there are any pressing questions on just kind of the federal level of conversation, or if we push through and Renee can begin kind of presenting on the contents.
All right, hearing none, I'm gonna just jump in then. I don't see any questions in the chat. All right, so I'm gonna jump in. Thank you so much, Noelle. As Noelle mentioned, I'm Renee Williams at the National Housing Law Project. And I just wanted to take a second to really thank the Freedom Network team and for you all for having us to talk about this really important issue. As Noelle mentioned, there's a lot going on right now. And so we're hoping that with this webinar, we can at least start to provide some clarity about what is and isn't happening, and, start thinking about, the future in terms of, how to really work with your clients and, make sure that your clients are able to stay stably housed right now and, for the longer term. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take, build off of what Noelle talked about, and she gave a really broad overview, and I'm going to, dig a little bit deeper on some of the points that she made with that really excellent recap. And so I'm covering a lot of ground today. We do not have slides, and I believe Ivanka is gonna put some links in the chat. And what I wanted to just share with you all is that all of this detail that I'm going through, is really just a matter of trying to, produce some conversation, get some questions, kind of see what folks in the field are really wrestling with. And then in those particular resources, you can have more time, have the version in front of you, and I will allude to these resources as I'm talking. So all of that is coming your way. The Freedom Network team will be sending out a follow-up email after the webinar. I think Karen said in the next couple weeks or so. So be on the lookout for that. And as has already been put in the chat, you can always go to nhlp.org/COVID. That's sort of our landing page for our resources. So definitely go there for the latest information. So as Noelle mentioned, what we're really going to focus on today is the CDC moratorium. We had a part one earlier in the summer where we talked about eviction moratoriums generally, where it was, a lot of kind of moving parts, and that's still true. But really the biggest change is the CDC moratorium. So the CDC, what happened was the CDC in September issued an order that placed a nationwide moratorium on evictions for non-payment of rent, as well as other fees or charges, through December 31st. So there's, even within that, there's a lot to unpack and a lot to flag. So the first thing is that, very important to note that this is focused on evictions for non-payment. And we'll get to, the exceptions that the order lays out later, but just kind of know the universe in which, we're really focusing on. So it's tenants who, are facing financial hardship, and there are actually several requirements that we're going to talk about. But we're talking about evictions for non-payment of rent and associated fees and charges. This order, and you might be thinking, why wasn't this issued by HUD or, another agency, why the CDC? And, and I think folks, particularly folks who do this work, completely understand, that, and Noelle alluded to it as well, that, housing insecurity is a health issue, but I think here in particular, it's very, it very much, the pandemic has really focused, our attention on the fact that, if you have folks who are housing insecure, as Noelle mentioned, moving from place to place, that is really going to facilitate the spread of COVID. So this is meant to be a public health measure. So what you need to know about the moratorium. And again, and as you're seeing kind of populated in the chat, there are a few documents. They're in our FAQs specifically written for a renter audience, both in English and Spanish. So if you're looking for something to share with your clients, I think that was one of the questions that one of the registrants had. I'm sure a lot of you are thinking about this. You can provide those specifically for renters, and we have them in English and Spanish. And I'll talk about other important materials that are also translated as we go through. So, but what you need to know is that, this moratorium applies to housing broadly speaking, meaning that, if you joined us for the first webinar this summer, we were talking about the CARES Act and trying to figure out, okay, like, is this housing covered? What does that mean? Go to this website, look it up. So the good news is that that distinction is not made here, right? So this doesn't just apply to housing that receives any sort of federal subsidy. It also applies to private housing. So I think that is kind of the big first important point to note. So the order has specifics on what types of structures are covered, but the general idea is that, it's a unit or a structure that is leased for residential purposes. So, if somebody has the power to evict, then that eviction is stopped. So that's really the thinking around this, and trying to kind of pin down, what are the outer limits of the moratorium. But, it is meant to be construed broadly. Hotels and motels that are rented to temporary guests. So, I kind of see that as folks who are, traveling, not folks who are necessarily, using this as their residence. And some of that too will kind of turn on state law. But the sort of big picture is that, if it's somebody's sort of permanent housing where they have the ability to be evicted, this order likely applies. So the big,
Renee,
yeah,
I
go
apologize.
ahead.
Oh, the dog. He's back.
Oh, okay. Go ahead, Noelle.
No, I'm trying to avoid. Van Morrison, stop. the question that I have is if you could clarify, because we do know that a number of like housing shelter programs have also been using motels and hotels. And so it's not necessarily like travelers or transient populations, but I think it would be important to clarify if folks are sheltered in hotels and motels, whether they're covered here.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I do think that some of those specifics will really turn on kind of your state landlord-tenant law, and this is always the issue, right, with trying to apply sort of a federal requirement or an order on, you know, landlord-tenant law when landlord-tenant law is generally a state-by-state issue. And so, you know, my sort of argument would be that, you know, if this is somebody, you know, who is using a particular abode for or housing as their, you know, sort of permanent place of living, and, you know, the landlord housing provider has to go through an eviction process to evict them, then the order applies. But if folks have specific questions in mind, definitely feel free to reach out and we can kind of hash out the individual facts, just because sometimes state law will come into play. The second point that I wanted to stress is, so, and Noelle touched on this as well, it's in effect until December 31st. And when we're talking about eviction, what we mean is that people can't be physically removed from their homes for the rest of this year. That's what you really need to think about in terms of an eviction moratorium. As Noelle mentioned, you know, housing providers may still be able, or can, the order clarified, still file an eviction action in court. And, you know, depending on what the state procedure is, there can be negative consequences for a tenant if they don't respond, right? If something is filed in court and that process is moving ahead, there may be negative consequences. So, and if you attended the last webinar, this refrain is going to sound old, but the idea is, you know, if you have a client, you're working with them and you're talking to them about housing, you know, and they've fallen behind on rent, kind of the one big takeaway is that if somebody gets an eviction notice, they need to try and speak to a lawyer, if at all possible. So try to contact local legal aid, because every state is going to be a little bit different. There may also be state protections that sort of interact with the moratorium. So it's just really, really important to get legal counsel and not rely on this idea of, oh, there's an eviction moratorium, nothing can happen to me. Because while it's true that people can't be physically removed from the property, they're able to, if housing providers are still able to file eviction actions in court. For those of you who deal with clients who are housing insecure, who have experienced eviction, that can have some really negative downstream long-term consequences, particularly if you have a client who, you know, at some point, even if they lose this particular housing, you know, they need to move elsewhere and that eviction record can follow you. So again, you know, that's just such an important point that no matter what people think in terms of, you know, the protections that they might have, or they see something in the media about, oh, like, can't be evicted, it's really important that, you know, tenants, if at all possible, talk to a lawyer so they can preserve their rights and their protections. So, you know, that's just a really important point. The other important point is that landlords are not required to inform the tenant about the order. So, you know, it's very possible, of the eviction order, sorry, the CDC moratorium order. Let me just say that again, because I totally garbled that. Landlords are not required per the order, the CDC order, to tell tenants about this eviction moratorium. And so, you know, in some places, you know, it might seem like business as usual because there may not also be local protections either. And, you know, we've definitely heard reports across the country that there are a lot of tenants who are not aware that this moratorium exists. Yeah, that's a good question. I see something pop in the box. If there's a filing for an eviction for the end of the year, and you know, it could be now, or the moratorium could be extended. If the moratorium looks like the same moratorium as there is now, then you really are still just kind of kicking the can down the road in terms of when somebody can be removed. But, you know, if there is any gaps, right, in when one moratorium ends, the other begins, you know, there can definitely be a lot of confusion and issues there, and you might see people who fall through the cracks. So I think it's still too early to kind of know what that's going to look like, because I think a lot of it will also depend on if there's a gap in coverage or not. Of the moratorium. So, you know, for folks who remember the Karazhak Moratorium, which was, you know, back in March, and you know, really, I believe it was late August when folks could get eviction actions filed in court. And, you know, there was a gap, right? Like there was, you know, the CDC order did not come out until September. And so, you know, again, just be on the lookout for those types of gaps. So it's a really good question, and I hope I answered it. So just taking another step back. So tenants, and this is again really important. Oh yes, good question. And I'm trying to keep track of the chat just so that the answers are still relevant. Yes, that's correct. The landlord doesn't have to inform a tenant that the CDC moratorium order is in place. So, so what that means is, you know, and I will say, state and local eviction, landlord tenant law will still apply, right? So the owner, if notice is normally required in your state, the owner can't just not give you a notice and go to evict you, right, in court. But they don't have to tell you about the CDC order. So that's what I meant. And I do want to move forward. So I do see people populating the chat. I just want to make sure I get through all of my my points, but we're trying to leave plenty of time open for questions. So tenants, and this is kind of the big kind of the big part that I think folks should really pay attention to with respect to the moratorium, is that tenants who are seeking protections from the eviction for non-payment, and this is where the notice issue, so I'm really glad, Candy, you asked that question. This is where the fact that the landlord doesn't have to tell you about the moratorium comes into play. And because in order to be protected by the moratorium, the burden is on the tenant to fill out a signed declaration and give it to their landlord. There is a declaration form. Noelle alluded to it earlier. There's a declaration form, and I believe if you remember our nhlp.org/COVID URL, on that site we do have links to the CDC declaration in a number of languages. So you know, for folks who are working, you know, and I want to say it's definitely over 15 languages. It could be more. So even if you think, oh, like nobody ever translates anything into this language, definitely take a look and check out that sort of compiling of the translated versions of the moratorium. And just so that folks are aware that those exist. So the declaration, which somebody has to sign under penalty of perjury, it lists out the requirements, which I'm going to tick through. One is that the tenant has to expect to have an income of less than $99,000 in 2020, or they got a stimulus check, you know, back from the CARES Act. they got a stimulus check, or they weren't required to report income to the IRS in 2019. And so again, there's going to be, there are resources that kind of outline all of these requirements. So I'm just going to go through the rest and expand on them. So that's a sort of income requirement. Can't go above a certain income. The second is that you have to be unable to pay full rent, make full rent payments due to what the order says is a substantial loss of income due to job loss, reduction in hours, so something tied to employment, or extraordinary medical bills. So there's a lot to unpack there, but I think the biggest sort of takeaway, and I think somebody had this question, somebody doesn't have to have COVID to take advantage of this. This is really meant to sort of address the larger economic impacts of the crisis. So somebody doesn't themselves or in their family have to have been diagnosed with COVID to be able to use the declaration. Next requirement is that the tenant is certifying that they have used best efforts to obtain governmental rental assistance. And so, in practice, I don't know how that's actually shaking out in the field, but I would say that if you're working with a client, and that they, they might be able to use this order to help them. You might just want to also help them walk through what sources of government assistance, whether it's local rental assistance programs. The National Low Income Housing Coalition has a running list on their website of, local rental assistance programs. As folks know, most of those are, pretty oversubscribed just generally, but because this is a requirement, you might want to just, take that extra step and help your client kind of research what those possibilities are, and even throw in an application, if there's funds available. The next requirement is that the tenant will be likely to become homeless or forced to live in close quarters in another residence if they are evicted. So it's pretty, somebody loses their housing or they have to go double up with, someone else, because that kind of goes back to the public health issue here. And then the tenant also has to promise to make timely partial payments that are as close to the full payment of rent as individual circumstances permit. And, again, so, they're having to say, I will pay what I can afford. And I believe in one of the documents that is on the NHLP website kind of talks about all these requirements in more detail. So, definitely look there. So those are the requirements that somebody has to, and they're all contained within the declaration that they have to sign under penalty of perjury. Each adult household member on the lease should fill out the declaration. This new FAQ kind of talks about circumstances where, but I would suggest that every adult in the household, if it's possible, to just go ahead and individually fill out the declaration. Best practices here in terms of making sure that the housing provider gets the declaration, if at all possible, try to either send it by certified mail, make a copy, or the more recent guidance has said that electronic submission of the declaration, so an email, is possible, so is acceptable. And so, that's also a way for folks to track, they can print out the email, I sent this email to the landlord. So just whatever method folks choose, just make sure that you have a record that you did send the declaration to the landlord. Talked about the translations. Again, landlords, they're not required to tell you about the order. And so, it's in practice, it's very unlikely that, landlords or, who aren't looking to, help tenants stay housed, aren't necessarily going to be providing them if they're not already. So, and it's not every housing provider, obviously. There are a lot of housing providers who are trying to keep folks in their homes. And I'm gonna try and get through just the last little bit here so that we can leave time for questions about the order. So the exceptions, right? So this is non-payment of rent is what we're talking about here in terms of who's protected from the order. And then the order covers a series of lease violations for which somebody can be evicted. So engaging in criminal activity on the premises, threatening health or safety of other tenants, though I will say that does not include somebody having COVID who is taking, health precautions, and isolating themselves, et cetera. So, a housing provider can't evict somebody just because they have COVID. Damaging or posing, an immediate threat, an immediate and significant risk of damage to property, rather. So really what we're talking about here are violations that kind of threaten the health and safety of either, other residents or threaten property. Oh, there's a little bit of static. Okay. Thank you. All right. And so, when you're thinking about, if you're working with a client who gets an eviction notice, try to see what is being, alleged in terms of, why somebody is being evicted. If they're behind in rent, but they might be evicted for something else, So again, that's why it's so important for folks to be able to, if at all possible, talk to an attorney, just to understand, what's the basis of the eviction, what are the protections, and then, particularly with trafficking survivors, there may also be, for example, domestic violence. There may be other intimate partner violence, such that there might be other legal protections as well that, somebody can't be evicted, for domestic violence in this particular state. A number of states have those types of protections. Some states, also have eviction protections, for trafficking survivors. So, again, I'll just, I feel like a broken record, but because of the complexity of these issues, as soon as somebody gets that eviction notice, if at all possible, talk to an attorney. Another really important point, and this really underscores what Noelle was talking about in terms of rental assistance, and I think everyone on the line probably knows this already, but I just want to stress, the moratorium on evictions does not mean forgiving rent. And so, and unlike the CARES Act, so if folks, tuned in earlier this summer, talking about the CARES Act, where fees, et cetera, were prohibited during the sort of CARES Act period, that is not the case with the CDC order. So housing providers can still be assessing late fees, other charges. And so you can kind of already see how this is, going to be very problematic for a lot of folks whenever, we get to the other side of this and those protections fall away, because you're going to have a lot of folks who are in rental arrears. And, that the lack of rental assistance also feeds in to the other dynamic that's going on here, which is, there are already challenges to the moratorium, the legality of it. So everything that I've been talking about the CDC moratorium, the order may be invalidated by a court. There is a lot of uncertainty around it, and so, I think folks, I just wanted to stress, and we're at NHLP, we're definitely trying to to update our resources as often as we can. So you can go to our website, other, National Low Income Housing Coalition, other housing groups who are, trying to get that information out to the field. Wherever you've been getting your information about, housing protections, just, keep apprised of that, because there is, a lot that's happening. A couple of other just really quick notes. The order, if we have anyone, and I wasn't monitoring the chat super closely in terms of where folks are joining us from, but I just wanted to clarify, the order doesn't apply in American Samoa. And the reason for that is because, again, it's public health order, and as of when the order was written, there were no reported COVID cases, so the coverage could change. And then just a really important point is that if there are state and local protections that are in place, this order does not supersede those more protective measures that may be happening at the state and local level. So if you're an advocate, I'd really encourage you to reach out to a local legal aid office, somebody who works in landlord-tenant law, or housing advocacy organization. You can reach out to us, and we're also happy to connect you to try and figure out what is happening locally and at the state level, because you do have this sort of mishmash of protections. The other really important point is that there are some pretty steep criminal penalties for violating this order, in the sense of, housing providers who try to physically remove people from their units, jail time, fines, they're pretty steep and hefty. So, that's an important thing to note as well. There's so much in here about the order. The only other thing that I would just say is that, to the extent you're working with a landlord, housing provider, and there is all of this back rent due, there may also be the potential to enter into a repayment plan. And at NHLP, we're starting to really think about what all of this looks like when all these protections are lifted. And so, we're really trying to think about best practices around repayment plans, but, some considerations, and I think I went into them a little bit on the last webinar as well, but, just making sure that if you're working with a client, you're not setting them up to fail by getting them into a repayment plan that they can't afford, right? So, and also trying to see if you can get into the repayment plan an agreement that the housing provider will apply for any, federal stimulus, rental assistance, whatever may be coming, whenever there is a stimulus deal reached. Trying to think about other, other issues here. There's a lot, like I said. The final point I would just make, and I alluded to it earlier, is that, we've been doing a lot of talking about evictions, and, just don't forget the basics, right? If you're dealing with clients who need to stay housed, there are already eviction protections just more broadly in the law, unrelated to COVID, right? For survivors of intimate partner violence, et cetera. And so just make sure that you're not losing sight of, or the Fair Housing Act, right? Just make sure you're not losing sight of those protections as well. I'm sure there are a million other things we could go into, but I will stop there just to give us a good solid 15 minutes for questions. So Karen, I will turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Renee and Noelle. That has been really useful. And we have gotten a number of questions. So I'm just going to start off with what we've gotten in the chat and then go into questions that came in through registration. So one of the first questions was, what happens if there is a filing for an eviction for the end of the year, but then the moratorium is extended?
Yeah, no, and I think that is a really good question. And I touched on it a little bit earlier. I think the one thing, that I would just reemphasize is, just be on the lookout for any gaps, right? The moratorium ends at the end of this year, meaning that evictions can't be executed, meaning that you can't have the sheriff show up, until January. I don't know what, there may be a moratorium. It may be completely different, right? It might come from Congress. It might not come from the CDC. So I don't really have a good answer, because I think it really is going to depend on what the new requirements are. But if you have somebody who is, at risk of eviction, I don't know, I feel like at least practically we should be operating on the assumption that, the moratorium is going to expire. I don't know, Noelle, if you have thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I'll just say a couple of kind of contextualizing statements. One is that the administration has already demonstrated through this guidance that they're responding to the landlords and owners kind of against the moratorium. The other is that Senate Republicans have zero appetite for a moratorium. They're fully opposed to it. And so we definitely cannot anticipate a congressional moratorium prior to the election. Certainly not if there's a lame duck session wherein Republicans have lost seats in the Senate or have lost the election. And so, and because of the rollback that CDC has initiated, I think it's safe to assume that they will not be extending what's sort of left of the moratorium in that interim. And so I think we should be operating under the assumption that we're really going to have to be rescuing folks in the new year. And, we can hope for the best, but I think it's really, really important that we're prepared to defend clients with the assumption that December 31st is the end of the moratorium.
Great, thank you. Another question that came in was around an organization who they hold the lease, and they have clients within that housing program who don't pay rent, but they're being supported by that organization. And so in the event that the person, the survivor that they're leasing to, or not leasing to, but that they're supporting within that unit does not fit the program specifics, or they have violated the community expectations, can that individual be removed, or does an eviction moratorium cover them?
Noelle, do you want to take this, or do you want me to? It's up to you.
I'm sorry, where is that in the chat, Karen? I just want to make sure I fully got the question.
Yeah, I will send it over to you. And I believe me, the same person asked a question about having two roommates who one was following CDC guidelines to avoid spread.
So if the agency is the lessee, I would assume that means that you're operating a sort of program like not necessarily a shelter. It might be some sort of transitional housing program, or even a rapid rehousing program where you use a building that you do not own. The person who would threaten to evict might be the owner, but they'd have to be threatening to evict your program at this point. So I would assume, and I would say that the best defense you should go after using legal aid assistance, if you're concerned about this, would be that you have the ownership over who is within your program. There might be provisions within the lease where the landlord says, like, if there are this, or the owner says, like, if there are this number of calls to the police, we're going to step in. But I would assume that it's your decision whether or not you would evict program participants. So the only concern would be whether or not the owner or the landlord threatened to evict your program. So if you own the lease, it's just whether or not they serve you a notice. In that case. And I'm assuming, I hope, to whomever the question came from, that my assumption is correct, that this is kind of like if you're running some sort of transitional or temporary program with stay.
Awesome, thank you. Another question that came in is there's a participant who had, or one of our participants during this peer support call, who has a client that received a 14-day eviction, and they called New York law and they stated that there was no extension on the moratorium. So how could they proceed to get that client information in order to best be informed?
Yeah, and to the person who sent that to the chat, please feel free afterwards to reach out to Noelle and me. You know, I think if you're talking about New York law, I'm not sure if that is necessarily legal aid or another organization. What I would say is, you know, that client really needs to talk to a legal aid attorney. And you know, the fact that they have an eviction notice, I think they're much more likely, you know, to be able to get legal services, just because legal services tend to prioritize folks who have an eviction notice in hand. But yeah, what that might be talking about in terms of there's no extension on the moratorium, they may be referring to the CARES Act, for example, which did expire back in, Noelle, help me out here. Was it August, I believe, the CARES Act?
Yes.
Yeah, so that might be what they're talking about here. And even within that, there's still this 30-day notice requirement. So there seems to be a lot of not understanding what the state of the law is now. So definitely feel free to reach out to us. We do know legal aid folks in New York, and you know, try to figure out what the right organization to refer that client to is, because they should not be, you know, and the other thing is too, sorry, I'm just kind of thinking off the top of my head, it might also be, you know, that, and I'm not sure what the situation is in New York, but yeah, the housing provider may be moving forward with the eviction itself, even though the person can't be removed. But it seems like, you know, when they're talking about it not being extended, it seems like they might be talking about the CARES or maybe some local protection or state protection. So they're not talking about the CDC order.
Thank you, Renee. The next question is on repayment. So we actually got a couple of questions in the registration email as well as in our chat box. But just knowing that there are a high percentage of cost-burdened households in the U.S., especially with Black, Indigenous, and people of color homeowners, what would you all suggest could be a percentage of income that's reasonable to ask? And I think people in the registration, they also submitted a question on like, how do you even start? How do you identify what a repayment plan could look like?
Yeah, so those are excellent questions. And Noelle, feel free to chime in as well. I'll take the rent burden question first, because I don't know, we might, you know, I feel like as an organization, you know, as I mentioned, we're really starting to try to think about what this looks like. And, you know, we'll be trying to come out with best practices, you know, and I think you probably know this, just as a rule of thumb, right? Like ideally folks would not be paying more of a third of their income in rent. We know that that is not what happens in reality. You know, I become very hesitant to say anything above 40%, because that's sort of like the high end of the voucher program, right? Like tenants who are leasing with a voucher initially should not be paying more than 40% of their income in rent. You know, I would say anything over 50, for example, is just setting your client up, you know, for a real difficulty in terms of keeping their housing, because then there's no cushion. I don't think we have an exact number. I would be hesitant to go above 40 myself, but you know, and that is rent that's due going forward plus, you know, the additional repayment. And you want to make sure when you have a repayment plan that, you know, if you're starting, okay, we're starting a repayment plan in January, when your client pays January rent, to the extent you're sending more than your normal rent amount, you want to make sure that that amount counts towards rent first and not the arrears, right? Because then you end up in a situation where somebody is still in the hole, right, and can be evicted on that. So there's a lot to think through in terms of repayment plans. Noelle, do you have a magic number? I don't think we do as an organization. Yeah. Anything I say is objectionable to you?
No. So a couple things. One, NHLP is currently working on a model repayment plan as well as documentation that sort of helps to negotiate repayment plans with individuals. Our timeline is sort of actually contingent upon the CDC order. So we're really looking at publishing at the end of the year so that in spring, or, you know, like really kind of like butting up against that, folks can really make that negotiation happen. So you will see that doc. I can't promise it too shortly. But I think one of the things to consider, and kind of what Renee was trying to say, is that we don't want to so severely burden a renter with a repayment plan that they lose the ability to pay moving forward, right? And so I don't necessarily know that it is percent of income. One, I would want to make sure that the percent of income that you're using is any reestablished baseline based on how much income has been lost for the household due to COVID. But also, you know, really considering maybe duration of what you're willing. I mean, there have to be a lot of ways that you think about this, and it's not necessarily going to be a blanket where you just say like, never pay more than this. It might be that this person has gig economy income, and so you're really working to establish a time frame. You know, so many factors go into play that it really should be an individualized sort of thought process. The other thing is that you would really want to work into that negotiation. And this is not necessarily how you calculate it, but what'll be really important is saying, we agree not to evict you on the basis of non-payment due to COVID. And this repayment plan is a part of that guarantee, right? And so you're not just saying like, I plan to pay you back over the next 6 months. And then the guy waits till he gets his funds and evicts you the day after the repayment plan has ended. You really want to assure that if we're getting folks to repay you, they're doing so on the basis that they know they can remain in the housing through the duration of a new lease, or that they can re-up their lease, etc. So I think there's a lot of trickiness that happens when landlords say like, I want to get my money back, I want to get back quickly. Oh, and then I was done with you because you caused problems last year during the pandemic, right? And so that repayment should be conditioned upon remaining in the housing, at least through the duration of the repayment, if not beyond, depending on the lease.
Yeah. Sorry, I was just going to add, sorry, Karen. No, and I agree 100% in terms of ideally it would be tailored to somebody's individual circumstances. You know, to the extent folks are looking for templates, I saw a reference to the HUD repayment plan. They do have repayment plans on their website. You know, I think just by virtue of the fact that they are sort of template documents, it doesn't get at this issue of what Noelle and I were talking about. So you definitely want to, you know, if you have a housing provider who's using that template, even if it's a template, like you still, if at all possible, you know, try to talk to a housing attorney or an advocate, just to make sure that that plan is going to work for you. Because I think, as Noelle said, you know, the pandemic has really impacted people differently, and they might not have a job going forward. They might, you know, does it make sense to kind of cut your losses and try to move somewhere else but not have an eviction on your record? I mean, there's a lot of considerations to make.
Great, thank you so much. And then I'll just finish up with one last question. And people are curious if there is reader-friendly literature on this. So I'm assuming there's something that you can pass on to a client, to a survivor, where it makes sense and it maybe breaks down some of the really technical aspects of it. So is there anything that you all are familiar with?
So Noelle, do you want to, or I can take it. Sorry. Yeah, so on our website, there are, if you go to our webpage, there are fact sheets from the Alliance for Housing Justice on the moratorium, and those are specifically, you know, and they are translated into, I want to say 5 or 6 languages, and they are intended to, you know, for members of the public The renter FAQ that I sent around, you know, I think, you know, it is text heavy, so, you know, it's one of those kind of judgment calls. But we do have a couple, the renter FAQ and then the Alliance for Housing Justice documents on our site are intended for a renter audience and try to, as much as possible, dispense with all the jargony stuff. And I would just say too, like, does this make sense? Yeah. I would just say too, if folks have, you know, if they encounter resources that are really good and helpful that you think, you know, please reach out to us. We're trying as hard as we can to get this information out to the field. So if you can help us do that, that would be fantastic. So I'll leave it there. And Karen, I'll toss it back to you.
Great. Thank you so much again, Renee and Noel. You all have been super helpful. Also, if people are wanting to get in touch with Renee and Noel, it sounds like they're very open, so definitely let us know and we can make those connections. We will be sending out the follow-up email in the next week with this recording, but also the different resources that were mentioned throughout today. And if there's anything that you all have seen that, like Renee said, we want to make sure we're sharing and sharing amongst ourselves of things that have been useful. So please let us know because we would love to include those as well. Thank you again, and we will be talking soon.